Good morning, everyone. So it's good to be back with you. It's hard to believe 6 weeks has gone so quickly, but it's been a pleasure for me to be here. Appreciate your welcome of my wife and me to your congregational home. As we finish, wanted to look at a little bit, clean up a few things on the curse of Ham, and then TON is just an abbreviation for the Table of Nations. And I will not have you read 30 verses of names, early Christmas present, but instead I'll let a picture do 1,000 words and just show you a map of how people have understood it over the years. And then try to give a little kind of wrap up for our 6-week journey. As I mentioned, often when I teach this full version at Candler, we have about 26 classes. So to sort of give you a little slice of that 26 in 6 moments is kind of what we try to do today. So again, thank you all for your time and wrestling with us. In our last class, we looked at this kind of famous drawing of the 3 sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the idea that they were each different colors and therefore represented different races. We talked about in that context that this is one of those powerful examples of reception history, right? So that in Genesis 9, the person who's actually cursed is Canaan. But this story is almost never taught as though Canaan is the one that is cursed. It's always Ham. So there are a bunch of machinations people go through to try to say, well, Canaan was really Ham, or Canaan and Ham committed the sin. You know, where there is a will, there is a way to get it where you want. The question of then, why is Canaan cursed? The 2 most common answers, and this is how we ended our time together last week, is at the beginning of Genesis 9, it begins by saying, and God blessed Noah and his 3 sons. So people recognize, well, if God blesses them, then no human being can curse them. So it necessarily means Ham has to be kind of exempt from Noah's cursing. The second reason why it's argued Canaan gets cursed, and this is not in your Bibles, you will find this nowhere, but and look at an example as recent as 2012, you'll still hear this preached, which is Ham sinned, but his son Canaan was responsible as well. And they create this elaborate story about how Canaan must have been involved with the transgression, and that Ham told Canaan the sin, which is why Canaan gets cursed. So it ends up being this weird idea that, in modern parlance, Ham walks in, takes a picture and posts it on Facebook, and Canaan likes it. And therefore, he's guilty.
Is Canaan a single person?
Yes. Yeah, Canaan, all of the individuals that become names of nations are actually just people. So we're all descendants of one of those sons, or one of the people. So then the question is, how does Ham become black? So there are a number of scholars. The one who's done kind of the most extensive work on this is a scholar who was at Baylor, David Goldenberg. So he goes through kind of 1,700 years of history about how this passage was interpreted. I will save you that trouble and do it in 2 minutes. The first thing he looks at is the traditions around the name of Ham. So in Hebrew, Ham, it's an obscure root. We don't really know what it means. There are various theories that it could come from an Egyptian root. It may come from a Proto-Semitic root that gets translated. We don't know. Over time, it's argued that Ham, or Ham, gets connected to blackness, to darkness, and heat. So, since we are adults, we can do this. When someone says, I'm in heat, or an animal is in heat, what does that tend to reference?
Sexual
Exactly.
appetite.
Exactly. Tends to represent sexual appetites. So one of the arguments of what Ham's name means is that Ham is sexually charged. So this is where this gets interesting and a little messy. Not like it hasn't been messy before. Genesis 9 describes that Ham uncovered his father's nakedness. When that happens, if you're like me, you immediately think, oh, that means Ham was like passed out drunk and Ham walked in on his dad naked. How many kind of thought that's probably what he did? Yeah, most people, right. What'd you say? Oh. There's also another use of that uncovering your father's nakedness. If you jump to the laws in Leviticus, and we won't read it for now, it talks about your father's nakedness is actually something referenced to his wife. So my nakedness is my wife's nakedness. So what starts in certain parts of Jewish tradition that gets absorbed by the early church is when Ham uncovers his father's nakedness, it was not Noah himself, but Ham's mom. So if you have this this person in heat uncovering his mom, what, right. So the argument becomes the sin of Ham is incest. And the product of that incest is Canaan. Yes, Freud, right? Right. If you're a Freudian, this line of interpretations.
Or Shakespeare.
True. Right. And so in that context, then, part of what emerges from Ham and blackness is this notion of hypersexuality. And so there's a scholar named David Whitford who talks about these myths of hypersexuality. And oftentimes it goes back to this question of what was Ham's sin, and does uncovering a father's nakedness have something to do with Mrs. Noah, AKA Ham's mom? So then Canaan technically becomes, and I'm bad at these genetics parts, this is part of the LSAT I guessed. Did fine because I passed it, but it's always that moment. So if your grandson is also the product of your wife, I'm not sure how that works in the family map, but that's part of the backstory of how this develops. Yes, sir. Wait for one. I think Alan's bringing you the mic.
Oh, sorry. Is it possible that when Ham slept with Noah's wife, that woman was not his mother? In other words, stepmother, and therefore maybe technically not incest?
Yeah, so one of the theories that arises, go back to, if you end up with three different sons in terms of their color, some have argued, well, maybe Noah had multiple wives. He had one white, one black, one reddish yellow for Shem. So in which case, Ham's sin was that he uncovered one of the other wives. That doesn't get much traction because most people realize, we're adding 5 or 6 things to the text instead of just 2. So there are standards where they go. But yes, that is one of the theories you'll see in the reception of this text, is that he may have had multiple wives of different races, which is why his sons ended up different colors / races. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. The last piece, and this is something I've kind of mentioned before, but as we wind up, just to kind of make sure, all of these racialized readings are not what the biblical writers were imagining. So again, it's one of those things where the text itself doesn't have any of these racialized contexts, but it gets absorbed and read into the text so that it becomes the dominant, at least in the American context, the dominant understanding of this. So as I mentioned, you'll find, starting as early as the 17th century through today, that this question of Ham and blackness and kind of the deviance related to that becomes the most common justification for slavery. All right. Questions on that before we?
How about in Britain and other places that brought folks from Africa before they ended it?
Yeah, I know it existed in Britain.
This same theory?
Yes. I don't know about the rest of the continent of Europe. But Mark Knoll does some work where he looks at tracing it from Britain to America. Kind of the argument that we are the progeny of our British ancestors. So we developed it in a different way because the nature of the slave trade in America was very different. But yeah, the antecedents to that are there. Yes, sir.
Was there any, at the time this was going at the time this was going on from whatever the 1700s, forward, was there any Hebrew interpretation that came out against this, Protestant interpretation?
By Hebrew, do you mean kind of with Jewish traditions?
Yeah, Jewish tradition, because you would think that they would have thought about this for longer than
Right.
people in the 1700s who were interpreting it.
Yeah, so there you get kind of a mixed bag, which is true in Christian tradition as well. What you'll see is in some contexts, and I'm trying to remember the scholar's name who, Benjamin Braude, B-R-A-U-D-E, goes through this. And part of what he talks about is you'll see a lot of critiques about the kind of philology, that is the study of the Hebrew words behind it that justifies it. And so many will critique that and say, well, no, get hooked on phonics in Hebrew, and you will never go there, right? If you study Hebrew with me, you say this in class, you fail the class. Not because it's like racist, it's because it's just bad Hebrew. Like, you're embarrassing me if you come up with that out of Hebrew, right? So you do have some of that. The counter narrative or the addition that Braude adds is that in one part of Jewish tradition, in the 2nd century, I believe he locates it, so 1500 years before this, there's a strand of interpretation that talks about Ham's hair became curly because he twisted his neck to look at his father's nakedness. His lips grew thick because he blabbed about his father's nakedness. And so they begin describing black phenotypical characteristics as judgments for what has happened. So there is that thread. It's not a dominant one, but it is one that's there. So Benjamin Braude is one of the scholars who goes through that. Yeah. Cool. So, my gift to you is a map rather than 30 verses. The so-called Table of Nations, or Genesis 10, is a long list of names explaining the sons of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So, what territory does Japheth, who's mentioned here, what's that modern day equivalent? Right, you get to part of Asia, then as we go over here, all of Japheth is in that. Right, exactly. So Japheth is said to get parts of Asia and all of Europe. Shem gets what part of the world? Exactly. So Persian Gulf, Arabia, kind of what we sometimes now call the Middle East or Western Asia. And then Ham gets the continent of Africa. That's Genesis 10 in a nutshell. The 2 points that are kind of most interesting for the debate among scholars, and we talked about black religious movements 2 weeks ago. The land of Canaan, which again is in the news today. Who does Canaan belong to according to this map? Right, it belongs to Ham. What's the modern day name for Canaan? Israel, exactly. So in traditions like the Hebrew Israelites and other strands of black religious movements, the argument is that the original Canaanites and Israelites belong to Ham, which therefore means by American context, what race were the original Israelites? Right, they were black. So although this passage gets used to explain how Ham connects to Africa and therefore to blackness, in many black religious movements, the argument becomes, let's accept that for the moment, and now let's flip it. If Canaan was God's promised land from the beginning, then the first chosen people were black Africans. If Jesus comes from that same land, then what race is Jesus by American standards? Right, exactly. So this story in many kind of black religious traditions becomes a powerful tool to understand Christianity as our religion. And so you will hear a lot of those kinds of conversations. I think you had asked the question a couple weeks ago about where do we see this? And so one of the strongest vestiges of this is not only Hebrew Israelites, but particularly in hip hop traditions. this idea of a black-skinned Jesus, or as one former student says, a brown-skinned Palestinian Jew, right? Which again, now rings very differently given all the world crises. But if we take this as being true, then it relocates the Christian tradition to Asia and Africa. Because the last place the gospel went was to the land of Japheth. So it becomes a means of thinking about what this tradition is. Okay. I'll pause there for questions, comments, consternations. Yes, Leslie.
I've been trying to wait for this question. But this is going to sound heretical, but how much of this is, in the biblical sense, is mythic as opposed to historically based?
Yeah. No. Well, it's not heresy for me, but that I'm probably the bad judge of heresy in the Christian church. So one of the things that scholars, what we know about this table of nations is that it's relatively unique in the ancient world. Most traditions don't try to give you a map of the known world. They'll do a map of their genealogy. Right? What's striking is how decentralized Israel is in the table of nations. That's the piece that just stands outside the traditions that we know. What most scholars would argue, and I'm inclined to agree, is what this story is doing is trying to explain, as I put at the bottom, the political worldview. That I'm taking a snapshot of the world as I know it today. And that snapshot of the world as I know it today consists of these groups. Because what's significant, and again, only biblical scholars get excited about this, so the next 10 seconds will be like watching paint dry. Just about every name that is invoked somehow interacted with Israel, most often as an imperial power. So this is kind of the history of the nation of Israel in light of all of the nations that have interacted with it, which allows us to have some idea of when it's dated because, the Aramites or Arameans, they weren't around in the 4th century BC. So we can kind of date when they had to be around. So it's a sense in which it's trying to describe the world around them. The second piece in terms of kind of the history of it, we have decent archaeological evidence of several of these groups of people. They may not call themselves obviously what Israel calls them. Like an Egyptian doesn't call himself a Mitzrayim. That's a Hebrew designation. But we do have evidence that many of these ancient people groups existed and invaded that part of the world or controlled that part of the world anywhere from the 3rd millennia to the end of the 1st millennia. So it's kind of a hybrid of the two. But if you're doing like straight anthropology, most scholars would say, you won't get all of it, but you will get some of it. So that's kind of
Anthropology could have, myth has its roots in anthropology.
they're connected,
anthropological findings. So, I can see, I always think of myth as a way of explaining not literal history or and then it gets passed down.
Right.
And so I could see how history would pick it up and say, okay, this is it, but which is what I think your whole class is about.
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't know, this is fascinating.
Yeah, and so I think part of it answer more fully that question, so if we were to take a time machine, could we go back and trace every Cushite, every Caphtorium? Maybe, maybe not. But do they represent something that is historical? Absolutely. They may represent as much a historical memory as a historical fact, but yes. All right, so the example I give, I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Is there anyone here from West Virginia? Okay. Okay. So in Pittsburgh, yeah, exactly. So in Pittsburgh, we have very negative views of West Virginia, right? I remember doing one of those science Olympic things, and one of my friends on the bus, we were like 14, we crossed the state line, and he was like, I felt my IQ drop 10 points. again, we're 14, like how do we get all that embedded prejudice? But at 14, we had it. So if I'm writing the Table of Nations as a 14-year-old in Pittsburgh, I can map the world, and there really are West Virginians. And there is an assumption that as a Pennsylvanian, I'm smarter than a West Virginian. And that bias literally shapes how I write the narrative. It doesn't mean there's not a real West Virginia, not a real Pennsylvania, that there isn't a kind of rivalry, but I'm writing it from my perspective, so there's a particular bias that results. So that's how scholars tend to think about kind of these narratives. What's interesting about the Table of Nations and why it's unique, there's no judgment. It's just a list. And the one place there is a judgment is with Nimrod. My favorite name. How many have heard of the name Nimrod before? So in English, what does Nimrod mean? Idiot, doofus, yeah, exactly. Right. But as you said, Nimrod in the Bible is a great hunter. So for time, I'll just quickly skim it. So the first part here is from Genesis 10. So now Cush, who's one of the sons of Ham, the Cushites are often understood to be roughly modern-day Ethiopia. You'll also sometimes see Cush associated with Nubia. For those who are interested in biblical history, which is everyone, the Cushites and the Nubians spend a lot of time battling with Egypt for the powerhouse of that southern part of what we now consider the Middle East. What Kevin Burrell and a couple other scholars have argued is if you look at the Cushites, there are several times where they actually conquered Egypt. And why that is relevant is they conquered Egypt during the time that Israel was fighting the Assyrian Empire in the late 8th, early 7th century. Which means the pharaohs that the last kings of Israel and Judah dealt with were Cushites, who are unquestionably viewed as Black Africans. So as we look at that history of the end of Israel and the major threat to Judah, they want to argue that you're dealing with Black Africa in that moment, which again becomes a powerful tool when people start thinking about, well, if Jews escaped or ancient Jews escaped and lived in parts of Africa, and they were able to integrate into those societies, that raises questions about what their race by American classifications would have been. So now Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, or Bavel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Babel probably sounds familiar to you. Akkad, does that sound familiar to anyone? Okay. So Akkad is where we get the word Akkadian, which is one of the ancient languages that people in my discipline we have to learn. Because Akkadian is the language of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. So what Nimrod is credited with is building the first great civilizations and empires of the ancient world. And from the land of Shinar, you'll see that again in the story of Abram and his descendants. So the first great civilization comes from Nimrod. Then, from the dark ages of 2014 is this bottom commentary. And what I want to highlight is this last week. Nimrod, through his idolatry, military might, is a type of the Antichrist who is to come. Clearly, you get that from Genesis 10:8, right? This tradition of demonizing Nimrod, you've been with me now for 6 weeks. You know where this ends up. So our discussion about how Cain gets villainized follows, or Nimrod's pattern follows what we see with Cain. So in Christian traditions later, Nimrod becomes this sign of idolatry, of rebellion. Since Nimrod is associated with Cush, which is Black Africa, Black Africans are presumed to be idolatrous and violent. And so Nimrod gains the same kind of racial logic that we saw through Cain. And what I call Hamitic descent, that is this notion that Cush, who's the son of Ham, then everyone gets painted with the same broad brush of Nimrod.
What about that is idolatrous?
So the argument of what becomes idolatrous is building Babel. So in Genesis 11, what's the real famous big building that gets built? The Tower of Babel. Again, you will not find this in your Bibles. But the argument becomes, since Nimrod built Babel, Babel built the Tower of Babel, that was considered idolatrous, then Nimrod is an idolatrous, right? So it's that syllogism that they construct, which is how Nimrod becomes that. So you'll see throughout, particularly 19th century, and then this example of the Antichrist in the 20th and 21st century, you see that kind of language coming out. All right? Cool. Any questions on that?
So is that how Nimrod became a pejorative?
In part, yes. Yeah, so that the root of his name, the MRD or Mem Resh Dalet, comes from a root in Hebrew that means to rebel. So they argue that Nimrod in his name is this question of one who rebels. So that develops that pejorative attribute based upon how people parse the Hebrew root. And so then that pejorative parsing, well, his name means rebellion, so therefore he must be a rebel, which again, isn't mentioned in Genesis 10. But as I thought I heard you say, the ultimate rebel in Christian tradition is the Antichrist. And so they associate, if Nimrod is a rebellious by his name's meaning, then do we have actions to suggest he is rebellious? And if he is, the ultimate label of that in Christian tradition is as Antichrist. So that's how he gets to that point. Yes, sir.
I'm struggling with the timing of all this. Now, these interpretations are largely 19th and 20th century interpretations that are an effort to justify slavery. Is that what this is?
The racialization of Nimrod, yes, that takes place in the 18th century forward, yes.
Okay. And so we had a brief conversation on this in the past, but I mean, it seems to me that slavery was so inimical to the idea that was set forth in things like the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal,
Right.
that they had to have some rationalization to justify the difference.
Right.
And so this is passed on into the Bible to try to say, okay, well, the difference is biblical as well. Is that
Correct.
that's
Absolutely.
where we're going? Okay.
Absolutely. Right. And so we talked a little bit earlier, both privately and in class, if you're trying to make an argument as to why this is right, whatever this is, one of your major sources of appeal is the Bible. And so as I mentioned in our first class, right, that kind of the live white supremacy precedes any of these interpretations. And but for them, those interpretations don't emerge. But what ends up happening is, if you may remember the little circular diagram of live white supremacy, anti-black racism, biblical worldview, depending on where you enter that conversation determines how you assess it. And what has happened over centuries is most of Americans enter through that biblical worldview. And the questions of the live white supremacy behind it don't get addressed. Part of why this class exists is to try to argue we need to disentangle that, right? So that this isn't inherent to the biblical tradition. It's an overlay that's put on it that has become foundational for how the American engine turns. And that's part of what the class in 10 seconds is how to think about that and tracing some of that. Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Kemp, I'm going to just expose my ignorance. But do you have to have believed literally in the story of the flood to even get to the descendants all being from only Noah's children, and then drawing all these conclusions? Or do people believe some of this narrative regardless of what they think about that story and how everyone would have descended only from those three?
Yeah, that's a great question. So no ignorance displayed. The overwhelming majority of people who constructed this in kind of the colonial America, antebellum America, believed in the literalness of Scripture. So how do we have a world? God created it. Where do all people come from? Well, not Adam and Eve, but from this ark and somewhere between 8 to 12 people, depending on how many wives you think Noah had. So for them, this is the starting point. Now, sorry, remind me of your name, sir. Yes. Sadler, okay. So part of it, what Sadler was pointing out, is this sense of once this racial overlay occurs, then that overlay drives the narrative, even when the biblical story drops. So you will see examples, and we'll look at a couple, where people, atheists, who self-profess atheists, will argue for Black inferiority and will argue from it based upon the continent of Africa being backwards. The continent of Africa having all these tropes, which sounds a whole lot like James Henley Thornwell from 1856. So one of the exercises I do in class, when we do the full version, is I play a game called Guess the Century, right? You want to guess the century for like 30 seconds? Okay, so one example. It seems that Ham became a more servile people and may have moved south and wound up in Africa. The descendants of Ham, well, I'll edit this slightly. The descendants of Ham are those that God has destined to serve Japheth and Shem forever. And it is through that that they become members of the kingdom of God. So how many say 18th century? Yeah, so 1700s. Okay. How many say 1800s? All right. How many say 1900s? How many say 2000s? The lone voice in the back is right. This is a 2012 sermon.
Oh my.
The rest of you are also right, because that sentiment we can trace back to the 1700s. But the quote I'm reading is from 2012, and the link to that is in the Prezi, where you can see who said it. And to protect the guilty, I won't name the person, but you will recognize the name the minute you see it. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Who did it?
Dr. Kemp, what do we know about biblical historians? What do we know about the earliest days of the church in Africa?
Mm.
So before we start in all these interpretations and things like that, the church is spreading from Jerusalem in all directions.
Right.
And the Cushites, and they're telling stories and practice. I'm just curious about the practice of religion as we know it, Christianity, or maybe it's Judaism, in earliest Africa during those days.
Yeah, so I don't know a lot about that. But there are two scholars who've written extensively on it that I would recommend. One is a man named Dr. David Daniels. And the second is, Buntu is his last name, and his first name will come to me in a moment. But they've done a number of recent studies that unpack precisely that history. If you go back a generation, a guy named Thomas Ogden wrote a book, How Africa Shaped the Christian Mind. And so one of the things that's happened over the last 40 to 50 years has been an attempt to uncover exactly that. So you begin seeing some of those kinds of things unpacking. The destruction of Chancellor Williams, the destruction of Black Africa, was a historian at Howard University. And so one of the things he looks at is how many of the early kind of Cushite Egyptian architectural techniques, et cetera, get absorbed by Greek and Roman culture. And so what he tries to look at is what are some of the antecedents to the great Western fathers and mothers of kind of Western civilization. So you get it in those four scholars, the ones that come to mind. But I don't know a ton about that area other than I've read their stuff, but not enough to recall it. But yeah, that's absolutely part of what's at stake. And again, in these Black religious movements, I was talking George, right?
Yes.
Yeah, about earlier, that's part of what a lot of these Black religious movements have started uncovering in the last 60 to 100 years, is if all of this stuff starts in Africa, then what does it mean to recover an African Christianity? And does that provide an antidote to some of the corruptions of American Christianity? And if so, does that become a basis for true Christian unity? To go back behind the text before all of this started. So that's part of where some of them will do in that. Yes, George.
So I have two questions. Number one, I was thinking about how God blessed Noah and all of his descendants, but then Noah cursed Ham.
Yes.
And I was trying to figure out, which of those is more important, and I'm thinking the God blessing is more important than the Noah curse.
Right.
And when you showed the map, which is still on the screen there with the table of nations, and pointed out that Canaan, is connected to Africa, i.e. Black, and then you think about the possibility that Jesus himself was Black.
Right.
That, to me, seems like a real blessing, that would be celebrated by Blacks. So if you could maybe comment on that, even though I didn't phrase it as a question, which is more important, the God blessing or the Noah curse? And then secondly, somewhat unrelated, as Americans, we think about slavery, Blacks coming from Africa and from the Caribbean and so forth. But isn't it true that around the world, in various countries over the centuries, there has been a lot of slavery that was not enslaving Black people?
Yes. So start with your second question. Yes, slavery has existed. If you have human communities, you have slavery, right? It's like a cell phone today. Everybody got one. The main difference that, I won't call this a contribution, it seems too positive. Evolution brought to it from America, devolution, sorry, was a uniquely race-based one. And a uniquely race-based one that was in perpetuity with very little possibility of movement out of it. That's the American devolution bringing to it, et cetera. And so the power of Scripture is that it gives us an eternal standard. So you'll read James Henley Thornwell, Presbyterian minister, 19th century, pastor in South Carolina. He will talk about the great patriarch Noah, because Noah, in the beginning of the first great society, inscribed slavery as God's will when he cursed Canaan. And he will argue slavery is not bad, but quite good, because that's how God intends humans to relate. The link on the slide behind me will give you a 2007 version of that same argument.
But apart from what might be the scientific and historical explanation, is the statement of Acts 17, where it says, "The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, neither is he served by human hands, as though he have need of anything. He made from one every nation." So that's the best answer. Acts 17, verse 26, God, from Noah and Mrs. Noah and Shem, Ham, and Japheth, created the nations. Now, one major component in that happened at the Tower of Babel, of course, where God scattered all the nations all over the face of the earth and changed their languages. So the best answer is right there in Acts 17, God did it. And God sort of tweaked their ears and tweaked their eyes and their nose and their color of their skin and all those genetic, unique things in his creative power through the process of providential genetics to create all the different races.
Again, by a evangelical pastor that once you see that individual's name, you will know, like, oh yeah. So you see that continuing. All right?
So now Canaan is part of Shem, not part of Ham.
Correct.
Right, sorry.
Because what ends up happening, why Canaan shifts in certain, and this is from a 2023 Bible study I found online. Again, I search for weird things at times. So I pray I have to let Emory know, yes, you'll see white supremacist things on my computer. It's okay, I'm not one of them. But what you'll see in this context is Canaan can't be Hamitic if you now accept Canaan as Jewish. And if you accept Canaan as Jewish, as in the modern state of Israel. So you have to take Canaan out of Ham, because you can't have American loyalty to a black nation. So you have to excise it from that. So that becomes part of the argument. Because one of the unfortunate legacies of this is often the othering, although in the American context we focus on blackness because of the nature of the class, that otherness often gets attached to Jews. So Cain from Genesis 4 will often in the early church be viewed as Jews because they were the ones who killed the most innocent man that ever lived. Just as Cain killed righteous Abel, the Jews killed the righteous king. This language you will hear in the early church fathers. So as that kind of goes through the machine wash of kind of America's kind of racist legacies, Canaan gets excised for that reason. Right. Then to your second question, then I'll jump to the end. For many black religious movements, the blackness of Jesus is absolutely a central piece, right? And for my branch of the Christian tradition, it was my exposure to that allowed me to study this and not give up my faith, right? Because I've like had the tip of the iceberg of what some of these interpretations are and their after effects. But it was this understanding of the true history behind it that allows me and many to say I can still be Christian, or I can be a follower of Christ, which gets labeled as Christian, but not have to buy all of this. And because we're in church, I won't add the other word I meant to add, but, skubalon in Greek. All right, cool. So 2 last things quickly as we go. So I might have 5 minutes to wrap up, is that right? Okay. So in Genesis 10, about this division of the nations, that gets picked up in Acts 17, where you get the famous Paul at Mars Hill. This is a picture of Mars Hill today, where Paul is saying that God hath appointed all nations and assigned a place for their habitations. Paul then goes on to say, it is so that the gospel might be proclaimed. So this idea that emerges from Genesis 10 is that God creates the world and puts people in nations and countries and continents for them to flourish. You've been with me for 6 weeks, so your racial antenna ought to be up. What does it sound like to say God put people in certain places and meant for them to stay there? Segregation. Because he's dead, I don't mind using his name. Bob Jones, Sr. 1960, Easter address. Is segregation scriptural? He appeals to Genesis 10 as it's received in Acts 17 to argue absolutely. It's God's will that people be divided. And what I often share with students when we go through this full sermon, Bob Jones is actually a moderate. Because he makes the point in his sermon, I'm not saying that black people are inferior. There is no such thing as a superior race. Yay, Bob Jones. Right? And so he argues that the sin of American slavery was less the issue of slavery, more the issue of taking people out of their homes. The sin of America is that you have Chinese folk not in China. You have Korean folk not in Korea. You have German folk not in Germany. You have Africans not in Africa. That is the sin. He then goes on to say, because the good colored folk and the good white folk of the South have always gotten along. There's never been any trouble among us. Interesting revisionist history. Bob Jones becomes interesting that it would take until 2008 for that university to reject this argument and the prohibition on interracial dating that resulted. So the dark ages of 15 years ago, before that would happen. To close, and this kind of goes back a little bit to George, your question. For me, one of the goals of this class and kind of the mission to which I feel called is to try to draw a distinction between what it means to be Christian in America versus an American Christian. On the screen is one of my people. He's my people not because he is perfect, but because he captured a lot of things and said them so much better than I ever would, so I often just quote him instead. So how many recognize this Frederick Douglass or have heard of Frederick Douglass? Okay. Yeah. No. You laugh. I asked a student in class, how many have heard of Martin Luther King Jr.? And for the first time, not every hand went up. So at that point, a little bit of my soul died, and I stopped asking that question. Yes. So this is one of this quotation that's always kind of meant a lot to me. Between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. So wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of the one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. The doors of the church are open, right? For me, what we've been studying is what it means to be an American Christian. When the American values of embedded in the lie of white supremacy, in the myths of innocence, industry, and integrity, shape our Christianity, more so than our Christianity shaping our nation. The challenge for me and for this kind of work, and my wife partners with me in some of this work when we do what she calls obstacles to activism. And the idea of her obstacles to activism is often when we study these kinds of things, you'll feel a discomfort, you'll feel anxiety arise, you'll feel, to use the clinical term, arousal, which just means heightened emotions. And often that becomes fatiguing, like how do I keep fighting this battle? Part of what my wife does in her work as a clinical psychologist is she's created programs that allow white brothers and sisters in particular to work through those feelings, to have that cognitive restructuring to help support this work. Because in certain segments of American Christianity, I'm not invited. I show up and folk leave. That won't happen to all of you in this room. So part of the goal is to try to distinguish what does it mean to be a Christian in America versus an American Christian, which again is how much do these lies of white supremacy and the three I's and the myths that support it, how much does that misshape what Christianity is to produce what Frederick Douglass talked about, to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. The unfortunate challenge of this moment is many would deem what we are talking about here to be that very bad, corrupt, and wicked form of Christianity. So the challenge is how do we bridge that gap? That's what I invite you to join as you think about wherever God is leading you next. So as I close with a prayer. This is how I end every class. On the screen is one of the oldest prayers we have recorded in the Hebrew Bible. In English, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Yasa Adonai panav elecha vayasim lecha shalom. The last one is what I end with. In your Bibles, in English, often say, may he give you peace. Don't like that translation. The verb sims means to appoint, to place. And shalom, peace is fine, you won't fail my class, but it really implies wholeness. So I prefer to translate it, may the Lord appoint for you wholeness. In Christ's name, thank you for your time. So.